Could a war beneath the waves quietly decide the future balance of power in the Black Sea before most observers even realize it has happened? That question began circulating in defense circles after Ukraine revealed that a Russian Kilo-class submarine had been knocked out in what Ukrainian officials describe as the world's first successful underwater drone strike against an operational submarine, a moment that instantly reframed assumptions about naval warfare in this conflict. If submarines were once considered the ultimate survivable weapons platform, what does it mean when even they can no longer hide? The incident unfolded against a backdrop of intense Russian messaging that Ukraine is exhausted, overstretched, and nearing collapse. Moscow's narrative has been repeated steadily in diplomatic channels and amplified as talks about possible ceasefire frameworks continue to surface, especially with Donald Trump now back in the White House, and signaling a desire for negotiations that reduce U.S. exposure. Yet Ukraine's actions at sea tell a sharply different story. Rather than merely surviving, Kyiv continues to experiment, adapt, and strike in ways that force Russia to defend assets it once assumed were untouchable. According to Ukrainian security officials, the operation targeted a Russian Kilo-class submarine stationed near the Novorossiysk naval base, a critical hub for Russia's Black Sea operations. These submarines have been central to Moscow's ability to launch Kaliber cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure, while remaining concealed underwater for weeks at a time. Removing even one of these platforms does not just dent Russia's order of battle. It directly affects its capacity to sustain long-range missile pressure on Ukraine's economy and civilian morale. From Kyiv's perspective, that alone justifies the risk and investment involved. Western analysts have noted that the strike fits a broader Ukrainian pattern seen throughout the war rather than matching Russia symmetrically. Ukraine aims at the most expensive and strategically valuable nodes, energy facilities, logistics hubs, air defense systems, and now submarines have all been targeted not for symbolic reasons, but because of the cascading economic and operational costs imposed on Moscow. Each successful hit forces Russia to choose between replacing high-value assets under sanctions or accepting a permanent reduction in capability. In the naval domain, that choice is particularly painful as submarine construction timelines stretch into years even under normal conditions. The underwater drone itself remains shrouded in deliberate secrecy, which is part of its strategic effect. Ukrainian officials confirmed its existence and success, but released few technical details, leaving Russian planners to guess about range, payload, and guidance methods. NATO naval experts have long argued that uncertainty can be as disruptive as raw firepower, especially at sea, where defensive measures depend heavily on knowing what threats exist and where they might come from. In that sense, the psychological impact of the strike may rival the physical damage inflicted. From Washington to Brussels, the implications are already being quietly assessed. NATO navies have invested heavily in protecting surface fleets from missiles and drones, but underwater autonomous threats represent a different challenge altogether. For Ukraine, demonstrating this capability strengthens its position not only on the battlefield, but also at the negotiating table, undercutting claims that time is inevitably on Russia's side. If even submarines are vulnerable, what else might be next? The strike has raised a final unsettling question for Moscow and its allies alike. If Ukraine can reach this deep beneath the Black Sea, how secure are Russia's remaining naval assets, and how long before the balance there shifts even further? If the submarine that was struck mattered so much, what exactly made Russia's Kilo-class boats such a cornerstone of its Black Sea strategy in the first place? To understand the scale of the loss, it is necessary to look beyond the dramatic explosion and examine how these submarines fit into Moscow's broader military and economic calculus. The Kilo-class, known in Russian service as Project 636.3, has long been marketed as one of the quietest diesel-electric submarines in the world. Russian naval doctrine relied on this stealth advantage to offset NATO's technological edge, particularly in enclosed waters like the Black Sea. These boats were designed to linger unseen for weeks, slipping into firing positions and launching Kaliber cruise missiles before disappearing again beneath the surface. In practice, that made them floating missile batteries capable of striking Ukraine's power grid, industrial centers, and transport nodes with little warning. That role became especially important as Russia's surface fleet suffered repeated losses and was pushed farther from Ukraine's coast. Warships that once enforced blockades and projected power retreated to ports or operated cautiously wary of missiles and surface drones. Submarines, by contrast, appeared to offer a safer alternative. From late 2022 onward, Western intelligence assessments increasingly pointed to Kilo-class submarines as one of Russia's most reliable platforms for sustaining long-range strike pressure while minimizing exposure to Ukrainian counterattacks. Each submarine, however, represents a massive investment. Open-source defense estimates place their unit cost at roughly $400 million before sanctions, with construction involving complex supply chains that are now severely disrupted. Replacement is not simply a matter of money. It is also a matter of time-skilled labor and access to advanced components that Russia struggles to obtain under current restrictions. Losing one submarine therefore creates a gap that cannot be quickly filled, even if Moscow is willing to pay the price. The economic implications ripple outward. Caliber missiles themselves are expensive and produced in limited numbers, but the platforms that launch them are arguably even more valuable. A missile can be rebuilt within months. A submarine may take years. By knocking out one such platform, Ukraine has effectively reduced Russia's strike capacity over the Black Sea in a way that goes beyond any single night of explosions. Western military analysts have described this approach as platform denial, a strategy aimed at removing the means of attack rather than intercepting each individual weapon. From a NATO perspective, the strike also offers a sobering lesson. Submarines have traditionally been viewed as among the most survivable assets in modern warfare, particularly against opponents with limited naval forces. Ukraine's success challenges that assumption. It suggests that relatively low-cost autonomous systems, if properly employed, can threaten even highly protected underwater assets. For alliance planners, that raises questions about port security, anti-submarine defenses, and the future balance between manned and unmanned naval platforms. For Russia, the psychological impact may be as significant as the operational loss. Submarine crews operate on the assumption that stealth equals safety. If that belief erodes, so does confidence in one of the Navy's most prized tools. As Moscow reassesses how and where it can safely deploy its remaining submarines, a new uncertainty sets in. Will they risk operating closer to Ukrainian waters, or retreat even further, reducing their effectiveness? That uncertainty feeds directly into the next issue. If the Kilo class is no longer the silent hunter, it was meant to be, what exactly allowed Ukraine to pierce its defenses, and how much more capability might still be hidden from view? How did Ukraine manage to reach a submarine that was specifically designed to remain unseen, unheard, and effectively untouchable beneath the sea? That question now dominates discussions among naval analysts, not only because of what Ukraine revealed, but because of what it deliberately chose not to reveal. At the center of that mystery is the underwater drone Ukrainian officials referred to as the Subsea Baby, a name that hints at lineage without giving away capability. Ukrainian security services confirmed that the strike was carried out using an autonomous underwater vehicle developed specifically for this mission. Beyond that, details are sparse. There was no public disclosure of its range, speed, depth rating guidance system, or explosive payload. This absence of information is not accidental. In modern warfare, secrecy itself is a force multiplier, and Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated an understanding that revealing too much can neutralize even the most advanced weapon. Western defense experts note that Ukraine has spent years quietly building expertise in unmanned systems, compensating for its lack of a traditional navy. Surface drones had already reshaped the fight in the Black Sea, forcing Russian warships to retreat and altering maritime traffic patterns. The emergence of an underwater variant represents a logical, though still startling, next step. Rather than contest Russia's fleet ship for ship, Ukraine has pursued a strategy of asymmetric disruption, striking where defenses are weakest and assumptions are strongest. Speculation about the Subsea Baby's design has filled the information vacuum. Some analysts believe it may be related to earlier Ukrainian experiments with small torpedo-like drones capable of traveling long distances while carrying sizable warheads. Others suggest a hybrid system, remotely guided for part of its journey and autonomous near the target. What matters strategically is not which theory is correct, but the fact that Russia does not know either. That uncertainty complicates every defensive calculation from port security to patrol patterns. NATO naval planners are watching closely for similar reasons. Autonomous underwater threats have long been discussed in theory, but Ukraine's strike provides a real-world demonstration of their potential. Unlike traditional torpedoes which are launched from known platforms, drones can be deployed covertly, loiter near ports, or wait for high-value targets to appear. Defending against such systems requires constant vigilance, advanced sensors, and layered defenses, all of which are costly and difficult to maintain under wartime pressure. The strategic messaging behind the strike is just as important as the technology. By confirming the drone's existence without elaborating Ukraine's signals capability, while preserving surprise, Russian commanders must now assume that any submarine entering or leaving port could be tracked or targeted. That assumption alone can restrict operations, slowing deployment cycles and reducing overall effectiveness. In warfare, a weapon that forces caution can be nearly as powerful as one that explodes. This approach aligns with Ukraine's broader information strategy. Time and again, Kyiv has used limited disclosures to maximum effect, releasing just enough evidence to validate its claims while denying adversaries actionable intelligence. The result is a persistent fog of uncertainty that favors the innovator over the defender. As Russia scrambles to assess the damage and adjust its countermeasures, one critical question looms larger than all the rest. If this underwater drone is already operational, what other capabilities has Ukraine developed that remain entirely unseen, waiting for the moment they matter most? How did a navy that was once expected to dominate the Black Sea find itself increasingly on the defensive even against a country with no traditional fleet to speak of? The answer lies in a gradual but relentless reversal of power that has unfolded since the earliest months of the war, culminating in the kind of underwater strike that few analysts would have predicted at the outset. At the beginning of the conflict, conventional wisdom held that Russia's Black Sea fleet would enjoy near total freedom of movement. Ukraine lacked large surface combatants, had no submarines, and faced severe constraints on external naval support due to the closure of the Turkish Straits under international agreements. NATO warships were not going to intervene directly, and Moscow appeared poised to translate naval superiority into strategic leverage along Ukraine's coast. Instead, that superiority has steadily eroded. Ukraine's approach was never to meet Russia ship for ship. Instead, it pursued a layered strategy of denial. Anti-ship missiles pushed Russian vessels farther from shore. Aerial drones strained air defenses. Unmanned surface vessels penetrated harbors and struck ships at anchor. Each step chipped away at the fleet's freedom of action. By the time underwater drones entered the picture, Russia's surface navy had already been reduced to cautious sorties and long-range missile launches, often followed by rapid retreats to port. Western naval analysts describe this as one of the most significant case studies in modern maritime warfare. A combination of relatively low-cost systems has neutralized assets worth billions of dollars, reshaping how control of contested waters is achieved. The economic dimension is impossible to ignore. Every Russian warship damaged or sunk represents not only a tactical loss, but also a financial burden under sanctions that limit repair options and inflate replacement costs. The cumulative effect has been to turn the Black Sea from a Russian stronghold into a zone of persistent risk. For NATO, the lessons are both sobering and instructive. Alliance navies have invested heavily in large, high-end platforms designed for power projection. Ukraine's success demonstrates how vulnerable such platforms can be when facing swarms of unmanned systems operating across multiple domains. The fact that a non-NATO country has pioneered these tactics in real combat ensures they will be studied closely in Western capitals, not only for their defensive value, but for what they imply about future conflicts. Russia, meanwhile, faces a strategic dilemma. Concentrating ships in supposedly safer ports reduces exposure, but also limits operational reach. Dispersing them increases vulnerability to precisely the kinds of attacks Ukraine has refined. The introduction of an underwater threat further complicates matters, as it undermines the assumption that ports and anchorages provide a sanctuary. Every harbor becomes a potential battleground, and every deployment a calculated risk. This erosion of naval confidence feeds directly into the broader strategic picture. Control of the Black Sea was meant to give Moscow leverage over Ukraine's economy, trade routes, and coastal security. As that control weakens, so too does Russia's ability to dictate terms from a position of strength. Ukraine, by contrast, gains room to maneuver diplomatically, demonstrating resilience and innovation that resonate with Western supporters. The balance at sea has not fully tipped, but it has undeniably shifted. With submarines now drawn into the contest, the question is no longer whether Russia's Black Sea fleet can be challenged, but how much more pressure it can absorb before its role in the war is fundamentally diminished. What does the destruction of a single submarine really mean when measured against the vast scale of Russia's war economy and its ability to absorb losses over time? On the surface, one vessel may seem insignificant in a conflict measured in thousands of kilometers and millions of shells. In reality, the economic and strategic shockwaves from this strike travel far beyond the Black Sea, striking at some of the most fragile pressure points in Moscow's military system. The financial cost alone is severe. Estimates place the value of the destroyed Kilo-class submarine at roughly $400 million before sanctions. Under current restrictions, Western analysts believe that replacing such a vessel could push costs far higher due to limited access to components, skilled labor shortages, and extended construction timelines. This comes at a moment when Russia is already straining to balance its military spending against a weakening civilian economy. Energy revenues, once a stabilizing force, face growing uncertainty while the costs of sustaining a high-intensity war continue to rise. More damaging still is the loss of capability. These submarines were not idle assets. They were actively used to launch Kalibr cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities, infrastructure, and energy facilities. Each platform removed reduces Russia's ability to sustain long-range strikes without exposing surface ships or aircraft to greater risk. Western defense experts have repeatedly pointed out that missile inventories are only as useful as the platforms that deliver them. By targeting the launch systems rather than the missiles themselves, Ukraine imposes a deeper and longer-lasting constraint on Russian operations. The strategic implications extend into NATO calculations as well. Russia's reliance on submarine-launched cruise missiles has been viewed as a way to offset Ukraine's improving air defenses and maintain pressure on civilian morale. With fewer submarines available, Moscow may be forced to rely more heavily on air-launched or ground-based systems, many of which are easier to track and intercept. That shift could reduce the overall effectiveness of Russian strike campaigns while increasing operational risk. There is also a deterrence dimension that cannot be ignored. Submarines have long played a role in Russia's broader signaling, including implicit nuclear messaging tied to the dual-capable nature of some cruise missiles. While there is no evidence that such weapons were involved here, the removal of a submarine nonetheless weakens the credibility of that signaling. For Ukraine and its Western partners, even a marginal reduction in perceived nuclear leverage matters. From an economic warfare perspective, the strike reinforces a pattern that has emerged over the past 2 years. Ukraine's attacks on energy infrastructure, logistics hubs, and now high-end naval platforms are not random acts of retaliation. They form part of a systematic effort to increase the marginal cost of every additional month of war for Russia. Each loss compounds existing financial stress, forcing Moscow to make harder trade-offs between military ambition and economic stability. As discussions about future negotiations continue to circulate, these trade-offs gain political weight. A Russia facing shrinking options at sea and rising costs at home enters any diplomatic process from a weaker position than it would like to admit. The question now is whether this pressure will alter Moscow's calculations, or whether it will double down despite the mounting risks. If one submarine can trigger such wide-ranging consequences, what happens when Ukraine's underwater drones begin to threaten the rest of Russia's naval and energy-linked infrastructure? If this strike was about more than a submarine, what does it ultimately signal about where the war is heading and who controls the narrative as diplomacy edges back into view? That question now sits at the heart of the conflict's next phase. Because Ukraine's underwater drone success is as much a political and psychological maneuver as it is a military one. For months, Moscow has worked to project inevitability that Ukraine is running out of manpower, resources, and options, and that time favors Russia. This message has been aimed not only at domestic audiences, but also at Western capitals, particularly Washington. With Donald Trump back in office and openly questioning the long-term costs of U.S. involvement, Russian officials have sought to frame negotiations as an opportunity for the West to step back while Russia consolidates its gains. Ukraine's response has been to demonstrate repeatedly and visibly that it retains the initiative. The destruction of a submarine fits neatly into this strategy. It undermines the perception that Russia can safely strike Ukraine at will from the sea, and it signals continued innovation despite resource constraints. Western military analysts have emphasized that wars are often decided not only by territory gained or lost, but by which side can adapt faster and impose uncertainty on the other. In this case, Ukraine has forced Russia to question the survivability of assets once considered among its safest. NATO's role, while indirect, remains central. Alliance intelligence sharing training frameworks and long-term strategic alignment have helped Ukraine develop the capacity to integrate new technologies into coherent operations. The underwater drone strike does not imply direct NATO involvement, but it reflects an ecosystem in which Ukrainian forces learn rapidly and apply lessons faster than their adversary. For Western planners, this reinforces the argument that sustained support yields disproportionate strategic returns. Looking ahead, the implications extend beyond the Black Sea. Autonomous underwater systems are likely to feature more prominently in future conflicts, challenging long-held assumptions about naval dominance. If Ukraine can field such capabilities under wartime pressure, larger powers will take note and accelerate their own programs. In that sense, the strike marks not just a tactical milestone, but a preview of how maritime warfare may evolve. For Russia, the choices are narrowing. Increasing defensive measures around ports and submarines consumes resources and limits flexibility. Pulling back reduces effectiveness. Pressing forward invites further losses. None of these options align with the image of control the Kremlin seeks to project. Each successful Ukrainian innovation therefore compounds strategic pressure even without dramatic territorial shifts. Ultimately, this is about leverage. Ukraine's leadership has been clear that strength on the battlefield translates into strength at the negotiating table. By demonstrating that it can still inflict meaningful damage on high-value targets, Ukraine complicates any attempt to force concessions under the guise of exhaustion. The message is simple. This is not a country waiting to be rescued by diplomacy, but one shaping the terms under which diplomacy might occur. As underwater drones slip into the calculus of power in the Black Sea, the final question is no longer whether Ukraine can surprise its adversary, but how many more surprises remain before the balance tips decisively. Ukraine's underwater drone strike against a Russian Kilo-class submarine represents far more than a dramatic battlefield moment. It highlights a consistent strategy targeting high-value platforms to impose lasting economic and operational costs on Russia. Submarines that once enabled stealthy caliber missile attacks are now exposed, forcing Moscow to rethink how it projects power in the Black Sea. The strike also underscores Ukraine's rapid adaptation, leveraging unmanned systems to offset conventional disadvantages and reshape naval warfare. Economically, the loss compounds pressure on a Russian war machine already strained by sanctions and rising costs. Strategically, it weakens Russia's long-range strike capability and erodes the perception of invulnerability surrounding its navy. Politically, it strengthens Ukraine's position as diplomatic discussions resurface challenging narratives of inevitable Ukrainian decline. For NATO and the West, the lesson is clear: innovation and sustained support can yield outsized strategic effects. Looking ahead, underwater drones are likely to play a growing role not only in this war, but in future conflicts worldwide. The Black Sea may be the proving ground for a broader shift in maritime power. Does this strike mark the beginning of a new phase in the war where even the deepest defenses no longer guarantee safety? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more in-depth analysis like this, remember to subscribe to